Thank you. So fasten your seatbelt, because some of the things I'm going to say you will agree with, but they are in fact totally orthogonal to almost every country's education system. And education is what we do to people, and learning is what you do to yourself. And in fact, the only thing you have to ever learn is learning. And that sounds a little abstract, but I hope after the next, let's say, 20 minutes, you will think it's not so abstract. And I'm going to start with 4 questions that we commonly asked small children. Small meaning 5, 7, maybe even as old as 8. And one of my favorite questions was, how do giraffes sleep? Now, the truth is, I don't really know how giraffes sleep, and I suspect you don't know how giraffes sleep. But when you ask a child, and the child's answer is something, and this is one of the questions, or answers rather, that I love, was that the giraffe goes and finds a tree. And finds a tree with a branch coming out of it that is roughly the giraffe's height. And the giraffe then puts its head in the branch and goes to sleep. Now, whether that's right or wrong almost doesn't matter. What's important is it was such an imaginative, such a creative answer that that's what you want. It's actually not the answer, but being creative about finding it. So then you ask a children, even ask an adult, when you look in a mirror, things are switched from left to right. Why are they not also up to down? And so people puzzle, yeah, that's interesting, it got switched this way, but it didn't get switched that way. And 6- and 7-year-olds will discuss that, they'll do experiments, they'll bring in a mirror, then they'll sort of stand on their head, or they'll do other things. Let me give you, I said I'd give you 4 of them. Third one maybe looks a little bit more technical, but children are pretty good at this. You have a wheel rolling down the road, and it's going at 50 miles an hour. And you ask the child, what is the speed where that wheel is touching the road? What is the velocity? And the answer is 0. But lots of adults miss that. And so then again, it's a whole nother conversation. I'll show you the last one, which is perhaps the most amazing to me. In computer science, in mathematics, there is a problem called the traveling salesman problem. And this is a problem where a salesman has to go to multiple cities, and there are roads that connect the cities, and you have to find the shortest path. You want the salesman to use the least amount of gasoline, or whatever the reason for making it short. And if you have many, many cities, and you have all these roads connecting them, and some of the roads are straight, some are crooked, and you say, well, now computationally, that's so hard. And one child came up with a very interesting solution, and that was to find the shower curtain rings that you could buy in the hardware store, connect them with strings, where the length of the string was the distance between 2 cities. Then made this whole model on the floor with the little rings and the strings, and he says, you want to find the shortest distance, just pick it up and pull the 2 rings, and wherever they get taught, that is the shortest distance. And you say, my goodness, this is a computational problem, and you can build a string and ring machine. That's what you want kids to do, is to build, if you will, the string and ring machines of the world. Now, I have heroes. We all have heroes. This is my hero, and he's sort of the basis of a lot of what I'm saying. His name was Seymour Papert. Died about 6 years ago, and Seymour was a very accomplished mathematician. And Seymour would ask questions and make statements like this. You cannot think about thinking unless you think about thinking about something. And you unpack that, and then you say, wow, we don't really think about thinking that often. Go to a meeting where there are a bunch of educationalists, people who are trying to decide on the education system, and nobody in that room thinks about thinking. Nobody in that room really tries to understand much about learning. And that's actually a very serious issue. Seymour's solution was to propose, and this was quite a while back, said, imagine the fact that children learn languages. And you can take a 5-year-old from any country in the world and drop that 5-year-old in France, in Germany, in Greece, wherever, in Saudi Arabia. And within a very short period of time, that child will speak French or German or Arabic, whatever the local language may be. And we all know that. So if that's true, could we create a country called Mathland, a fictitious country? You drop the child in this country, and the child learns math. Now you say, well, that doesn't make sense, and it's different, but it's still provocative. It's provocative enough to start thinking about thinking, and the closest we can come is computer programming. Computer programming, first of all, if you haven't done it, you must. The reason you must is because it's an approximation, a very good one, of thinking about thinking. And the reason it's an approximation is that you've got to break down whatever you're trying to program into constituent parts of some sort and have what's called an algorithm. You sort of write out some lines of code that sort of execute this program. And guess what? It never works the first time. It really doesn't. And the child, let's say, is trying to draw a circle on the screen and write some code to draw a circle. Well, it doesn't work, but it does something else, draws lines across. So the child looks at that, and guess what? Whatever it did was some small evidence of what the child should correct. So the child goes back in, corrects the code, and executes it again, and eventually it draws the circle. That's called debugging. And debugging is the closest we get to learning. It's the closest we get to learning about learning. And let me tell you a story which I promise you is true, because the first time we did this was many years ago in schools, first in New York City, and we discovered that the kids who could write computer programs were better spellers. You say, wait a minute, what does that have? What does spelling have to do with computer programming? Especially in English, which is the worst language for spelling, because the spellings are not phonetic at all. There are exceptions, and so many exceptions. It's a terrible language for that. The answer is that the kids who wrote computer programs learned to love the bugs. They loved debugging. So what happened in spelling class? I was a bad speller, and we typically got 10 words that we were supposed to spell, and if I got 8 out of the 10 correct, I was thrilled, because that was a B. And the last thing that I was interested in myself was in the misspelled words. totally uninterested. Those were the mistakes. And I thank God I only got 2 of them, so off to the side. The debuggers, the kids who had been trying to, were fascinated by the words they got wrong. And guess what they did? The kids in the group that got the spelling exam, who had done computer programming, would go to each other and say, hey, which one did you get wrong? Oh, silly you. Don't you know it's I before E, except after C? Oh, I forgot that. And they would joke and play and tease each other about the mistakes. And because of that, guess what? They became better spellers. Versus the people like me when I was at school, and I suspect lots of you, we put them under the carpet. So one of the first basic principles about learning is to learn to love the things that go wrong, not the things that go right. So here is the same man, Seymour Papert, in Africa. This is many years ago, in the early 1980s, we were working with kids in Senegal who had never seen not only computers, but they didn't speak English or French. And they could write computer programs as if they were kids from an American suburb and a middle class. And they played that computer like a piano. So we asked ourselves, because they are the most precious natural resource of a country, how could we change learning in those countries? And I have to tell you, I have spent so much of my life fundraising for MIT, dealing with 1 laptop per child, doing it with heads of state. And when you tell a head of state, what is your most precious natural resource? Trust me, it's not oil. It's children. By definition, yet people don't think of it that way. So you say, okay, well now how can we make learning, because the first 5 years, 6 years of your life, all learning is through playing, and whether the playing is dropping something accidentally or putting food where it shouldn't be or where it's literally playing, how can you bring that into an education system? So as far back as 1982, which is perhaps not only before you were born, but may even be, sort of your parents were kids, we started doing this in African countries and later in Southeast Asia, and we discovered, perhaps it's obvious now, that children looked at computers and computer programming as not only something they could do, and something they could do quite easily, but when they brought, in the case of the photograph you see on the screen, those laptops home to these villages that didn't have electricity, you'd had a generator that charged it at school, the laptop was the brightest light source in the house. And suddenly I said to myself, wow, this is a metaphor, but also it was the light source of the house. And families in those houses would make sure the kid kept the laptop open for as long as the battery lived. And I said to myself, what in this picture, and I mean literally that picture, what in this picture will not be done by market forces? So if somebody asks me on the street, what do you do, or what's the meaning of your life, or some big question like that, I say, my job has been to do what normal market forces do not do. Because if market forces will do them, then they don't need me. But if they won't do them, they need me. And here was an example, happened to be a simple one at the time, to just build a laptop for kids that cost $100. And could you do it? Everybody said no. And just like one of Andreas previously said, when everybody says no, you know it's probably a good idea. It's probably a very good idea. So programming had fallen off the table. Computer programming, there was no malice. But Microsoft and others used it to write programs for kids to use. And they forgot for 25 years that it was the programming that was interesting, not the drill and practice programs that they had made. So that's when I started one laptop per child. And I don't want to dwell on that other than just go through some quick images, because it was a very photogenic project. It was a nonprofit, which was very important because that way the United Nations could be our partner. And we decided we'd build a laptop that you could crank and it would turn on, you wouldn't need electricity. All of that sort of happened. It's not important, the details. But what was important is that 3 million of them were built very quickly and distributed around the world, so there was some credibility. And that credibility was such that we could then go to governments and say, okay, we'll help you write the tender, because if somebody wants to sort of buy 1 million laptops, they don't just come to me and send me a check. Even though we had done 3 million of them almost that way, they write a tender. And when I helped write the first tender, this was in Brazil, we agreed that we would publish our price. We'd put it in the newspapers. And that nobody does that because you want to win it and you want to keep your price secret. Well, we published it by agreement. And when we published it, the winner was always 50 cents lower. And I loved that. I said, that's fantastic. I don't want to win these bids. I just want kids to get laptops. And after some number like 50 million of these things, we were able to do it. Why? Because we built the first 3 million. So what I want to sort of move is to the next step. And this image is quite important. This teacher believed in corporal punishment. And I wish I had the before and after image, but before the laptops, the kids were lined up in perfect little rows, and they were quiet, and if a question was asked, nobody dared answer. Because if they gave the wrong answer, there was a little whip there, you'd hear a little snap, and the kid would be punished for the wrong answer. Terrible. The laptops arrived, and this is the way he taught. We didn't train him, we didn't teach him, but suddenly he didn't know much more than the kids, and the whole experience of learning was different. So people would publish stories, because it was highly criticized, this was about 15 years ago, said Negroponte believes you can give a kid a laptop and walk away. I'm not sure I ever said that, but I was so criticized for it, I said to myself, wow, what if you could? Maybe we should try that. So we actually started, partly because of this young girl having such focus and seeing that, here's the question we asked. Can you learn how to read on your own? Common wisdom is no, you can't. You can learn to speak, but you can't learn to read and write. Our brains aren't wired that way. Evolution didn't work that way. And in fact, when writing and reading were invented roughly 3,000 years ago, we have to use a different part of our brain, and one that doesn't learn the same way because it didn't have the evolutionary process. So here's the proposition, and here's what we did. We said, okay, let's give kids, in this case it was tablets, it wasn't laptops, in villages that have no literacy, zero literacy. They haven't seen words. There are no road signs, there's no newspapers, there's no anything. In fact, there were no literate adults in the village. Nobody could read and write. So we found 2 villages in Ethiopia, one in the north, one in the south, and we delivered to the villages the same number of tablets rather, as there were children. And we left them in closed boxes, no instructors, no nothing. With, again, no humans, no written instructions, just closed boxes. The only thing we did is send into the village an adult the day before to show them where to put the solar panel, because we didn't want them to put a solar panel indoors, you wanted it outdoors, and then the kids figured it from then on. So what happened? Because the laptops recorded with great precision how they were being used, we were able to track very carefully. And in the one village, it took about 3 minutes for a kid to unpack the boxes and find the on-off switch. Now, that might sound to you as very simple, but these kids did not have on-off switches in their life. They didn't have cell phones. They didn't have wall switches. So to discover the switch, especially that quickly, was pretty interesting. And guess what? The student was the least, quote, qualified in the sense that he wasn't sort of as active and wasn't the, if you will, the popular kid. Nobody was going to school because there wasn't a school and no adults, as I said, had any education. So the kids sort of played with these, and guess what happened? What happened was that after 5 days, these kids were singing ABC songs. Everything was in English. English is not their language. Even the Latin alphabet wasn't the written form, at least in one of the villages. And then this happened. Now, I've spent a lifetime doing this, an enormous amount of my life, and I've never had a picture or a photograph like that one. These kids decided on their own that they would work in a group. They didn't call it school because they didn't have the word. The kid on the right sort of nominated himself as teacher, but look at the kid on the left touching the other laptop, the tablet of the other kid touching the. That was very different than one laptop per child. And what I want to leave you with is that after 2 weeks, these kids weren't just, singing ABC songs, but they really were exploring 50 applications per day, 7 hours a day. And 6 months later, they hacked Android. Now, think about that for a second. So what I really want to leave you with a thought, and I made a mistake when we did this experiment, is I said the names of the villages. What a mistake. And the press went and helicopters went to find the villages, and the experiment, insofar it was an experiment, was destroyed. But these are the kids giving press conferences, proving to the press that they could write and read, and it's very early on. So I would like to leave you that as sort of where that particular experiment went, but urge that as you think of your own learning, and particularly the learning of your kids, that you try not to be complicit with this whole idea of testing, which is near criminal, and expecting that some testing system is going to be an approximation of learning, because it's not. Thank you very much.
Nice, nice. Honestly, Nicholas, this was a very, very inspiring speech and very inspiring presentation. Personally, I was so touched when you said that our children are the most precious natural resources. And we have them. They are just right here, but how much we invest on them. So this is very inspiring, and let me open the floor to, if anyone has a questions, please feel free to ask. Any question in the audience? Yes, of course. We have 5 minutes, so we'll go with you. Then I see another hand there, then another hand here. So we'll start with you. Yes, can I get the mic?
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on how we're moving on into this digital age and how this gap is going to increase between those countries that are still, like in Africa, those countries that are still not catching up into the digital age, and how are we moving more and more further away from them? And how is that going to, influence the world? Because right now, the whole fourth industrial revolution is happening, and everybody is moving towards digital, and it's no longer computers. It's how computers can learn without us teaching them. And how is that going to influence us? And what is your thoughts on what are you going to be doing next, other than just one laptop?
Nice.
So the quick answer is that the so-called digital divide is not as real as we thought it was. It's changing very, very fast. If you visited the United States at all recently, it's the worst cell phone system in the world. And you say, wait a minute, I can go to Afghanistan and I get better cell phone service. And you say, why is that? What is this leapfrogging that's happening, and how can it happen? And yes, there is a divide at the moment, but boy, it's very easy to close it. It's not like shipping cars. It doesn't require energy. Bits have no weight. They travel at the speed of light. You've heard all of that. And so it's possible to join the digital age in ways that have never happened before. And so the leaders of the countries in the worst situation, and I share Andreas's feeling about Rwanda, they're desperate. And because of the desperation, they're going to take big risks in education. They're going to try things. Whereas the richer countries just move deck chairs. We move this here, we do this here, we do a little there. But I think you will see enormous advances in the next 5 years, even less.
Nice. Okay, we have one more question here, or we have two actually. Where's the other hand? Okay. There. Okay, but you start with this question, yes? Here.
Hi, thank you for the engaging talk. My question is, aside from testing, what do you think are some good practices or best practices to evaluate or assess whether students are actually learning what you've taught them?
We need a short answer on these because we have only 2 minutes.
Okay. Very quickly, you fell into a little trap, okay, because you said what you taught them. The reason I am allergic to testing is that you can see very quickly the behavior of kids. And it's a little bit like language tests. We have them in order to go to MIT. You have to have a certain language score, and people try to score on these tests and so on. So you can put me in a room with any one of those people for 30 seconds, and I can tell you whether they speak English or not, just because you're interacting with them. So the one big change I would make, if I had the chance, I was running a country or I was in charge of world education, is I'd get rid of grades of the other kind, not the ABC kind, the 1, 2, 3, that the 6-year-olds study with 6-year-olds and the 7-year-olds study with 7-year-olds. Bad idea. It's a terrible idea. And yet it's considered a sign of advanced learning, whereas the one-room school, which was a really cool idea, is the sign of poverty. So if I could do any one thing to change learning and education, it is to get rid of age segregation.
Nice.
That's what it is.
It's never done?
Yes.
It's never done as an experiment? It's never been done before?
Montessori advocated it. It has been done. It's been done sometimes without success, so people think that the idea was wrong. But read Montessori. Montessori took grades 1, 2, and 3 and put them together. And 4, 5, and 6, and so on. And then Montessori did something really interesting, because if you look at Montessori schools, there are no high schools. So what was she thinking? She's, so she's thinking, well, there are too many hormones at that age, so just go out to the country and don't go to school.
Nice. Nice.
A very great,
that's amazing.
very great person.
All right, so give one more round of applause to Mr. Negroponte. Thank you for being here, sir. Thanks a lot.